Gotta call my son-in-law and get him out to do
we're
mine.
gonna
My
get
husband's
started.
skiing.
Good afternoon. I will call to order this regular meeting of the Intergovernmental Relations Committee for today, January 30th, 2014. My name is Alondra Cano, and I will be chairing the committee today in the absence of Chair Glidden. Also present today with us are council members Barbara Johnson, Andrew Johnson, Jacob Fry, and John Quincy. There are 5 items before the committee today. Our first item is an overview of the state legislative agenda, and here to present the report is the city's IGR director, Mr. Gene Ranieri.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. My name is Gene Ranieri. I'm the Director of Intergovernmental Relations for the City of Minneapolis. On this presentation, I'm going to ask Melissa Lesh to go through the state legislative agenda, as well as, I think, a bonding process worksheet that talks about how the legislature and cities work together on capital bonds. And Ms. Lesh will spend about 15 minutes. And Melissa, you want questions during or after? Or?
Well, actually, council members, we're just going to, if we could take a moment to get the technology set up. I thought it was already here. So maybe if we could move on to talk about, it's kind of jumping the horse, but going to the RCA to talk about the minimum wage piece. And we can discuss that while we're getting the technology set up to do the overview for the legislative agenda and bonding, if that works.
Sure.
Okay.
Yep, that works for us.
So go ahead.
So if it's okay with all the council members, we will go on to talk about the amendment on the minimum wage. So we would like to move the staff recommendation to support, to make sure that the city supports raising and indexing of the minimum wage. And the following is what we want it to read as. The raising and indexing of the state minimum wage to at least $9.50 per hour. Do we have any questions on that? Sure. Councilmember
Yes.
Andrew Johnson.
Madam Chair, I was just curious why $9.50 an hour, if we could just explain that to folks versus, I know there's been some discussion of 10. We've heard things about within the city 15, and so I was just curious on that figure.
Certainly, Councilmember. Thank you for the question. First of all, I'd point out that the phrasing is to at least $9.50 an hour. So if there is momentum going forward legislatively to go above that, that would be a possibility. The dollar amount of $9.50 is a number that came from the coalition partners that are really leading the charge of this in this effort. The city is going to be a supporter of that effort, but we are not kind of the lead entity in that movement. So in that situation, it's really up to those who are kind of guiding that work to determine really what that number might be that they're aiming for legislatively. And that's the number that those who are leading this have landed on as kind of the floor. And so to be in solidarity with them and to help their actions move forward, we're going with the number that they have landed upon.
Great, thank you.
Councilmember Fry.
Thank you, Chair Cano. First off, I just wanted to thank our staff. I know it's an extraordinary task to take on to set up this legislative agenda, specifically Gene Ranieri and Melissa Lesh. Second off, I just wanted to clarify for the record that with this minimum wage, this would include sort of the tip credit or any restaurant workers as well. Is that correct?
Thank you for the question, Councilmember. Yes, that is correct. The clarifying language you see in here, you see the old language did reference tipped workers. We didn't want that word in there anywhere. We wanted to make it very clear that the raising of the minimum wage should apply to all workers, whether they are tipped employees or not. So just for clarity's sake, that's why you see the simplification of the statement in front of you.
Thank you.
Sounds great. So if there are no other questions, I move to approve the amendments as presented in the CRA. Did someone have a question? Oh, sure. Excuse me, Councilmember John Quincy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to ask a couple of quick questions. First of all, I think it was, I brought this forward to be on our federal agenda, was it 1 year ago or 2 years ago? And it was tied to Senator Harkin's bill. Is there any proposed change to our federal legislative agenda at this point, or should we revisit that in the as we set that session?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Quincy, we're going through the federal agenda now and we hope to bring a redraft in 2 cycles. And it's one of the issues we're looking at. What we're trying to do is take all the policy statements we have in the federal agenda, update them, see what's happened, and then make a recommendation. And we're looking at federal wage, minimum wage. There are some different numbers and different policies which we'll bring forward.
Thank you. Also, I was just curious, is there a sponsor of this bill in either the House or Senate?
Madam Chair and Councilmember Quincy, excuse me. I can read you the House file and Senate file numbers as well. In the House, Representative Winkler is carrying that legislation. That's House File 92. That's the bill that has the dollar amount of $950. The Senate companion to that is Senate File 3. That Senator Eaton is carrying. The Senate file does have a different dollar amount in there of $7.75 an hour. So that's really where you're going to see the difference between the two files is going to be in that, what that floor dollar amount is going to be.
Yeah, and assuming something gets passed on both chambers, it'll end up being in some sort of conference committee to come up with something.
That is correct, and it'll be up to those negotiators.
And I know we work with a lot of partners on bringing this forward, so I just wanted to acknowledge that and thank them for that support. Has this been added to the League of Minnesota Cities agendas at all, or metro cities?
Councilmember, I don't believe so, but because we are lucky enough to have staff here today, I'm getting the affirmative no, it has not.
But that's so.
Are there any other questions on this agenda item? Seeing no further questions, I move the approval of the amendments that are presented in the request for council action before the committee. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. The motion carries. Can we go back then to item number 1? Okay, so the overview of the legislative agenda, please.
Thank you, councilors, and thank you for your patience with our technology. We just wanted to take a moment to give you a very quick overview of how the city approaches our legislative agenda adoption process and the process for items, for projects making it onto the city's legislative agenda as it pertains to our bonding priorities. This is a real 30,000-foot view, and IGR is planning individual meetings with all of the committee members to really drill down into this a little bit more and answer some real specific questions for you. But just for today's sake, for the 30,000-foot view, you should have this attached for today's meeting. So the IGR department really works in an annual cycle, and actually in a biannual cycle process, which is dictated in large part by the actions of the state legislature. If you start thinking about this at the end of the summer and start from that point in time, that's the time when IGR has historically solicited legislative ideas from elected officials, department heads, staff, community members, our partners at nonprofit organizations, our partners at affiliate metropolitan agency organizations, to really be thinking about what do we want to move forward into the upcoming legislative session that usually starts January or in some cases February. That process usually takes a couple of months. We really try to spend time vetting those ideas, getting feedback from as many stakeholders as possible. So by the time something makes it to the council for potential inclusion in the final legislative agenda for final adoption in December, we really hope to have consensus at that point in time. And we would like to move forward on items that we think really can be actionable and successful in that upcoming legislative session. So you'll see in the first slide, we start that process at the end of the summer. What we did differently, and there's a note here in the fall about the policy liaison team. We're really excited about this, and some of you have already been briefed on this. As I mentioned, historically, we had solicited ideas from department heads and division heads and elected officials. What we started in the fall of 2013 was a policy liaison team, and we specifically asked department and division heads to identify staff from within their departments who are not department and division heads, but really were maybe in kind of the middle layer of management in the departments and really had their pulse on what was going on throughout that particular piece of the enterprise, that they knew what was going on in their professional associations and had really good relationships throughout that particular department. We brought that cross-sector, that enterprise-wide approach, and we brought all those staff together to form the city's new policy liaison team. That team met throughout the fall and vetted each other's proposals. So an idea that came from the police department would then be heard by Reg Services, and really that fostered great collaboration. We were really able to get a better 360-degree idea, kind of a perspective of that proposal. It was really interesting to see that some departments were working on things that sometimes other departments weren't aware of, and this really became a great hub for information sharing. The ideas that came out of that process were then presented to the IGR subcommittee, and the IGR subcommittee at the time, subcommittee chair, for their input and feedback. And then a final proposal was then offered to the City Council for final approval in the end of December. Those items were then adopted and then move forward and will be our legislative agenda for the 2014 session. One thing I will note is that our legislative agenda does roll over each year. So if something is on the agenda from last year, it doesn't need to be resubmitted for another year. We always take amendments. If something has been accomplished, we'll delete that. But we don't want to put the burden on departments to be resubmitting the same proposals every year. So that process takes us then through the end of December for final council action. Usually at almost the last, if not the last, council session of that year. We want to give everyone as much time for input as humanly possible. And moving forward, just some examples, and I'm sorry this doesn't seem to be fitting on my iPad, but you have in front of you just some examples of items that are on the city's legislative agenda. Our agenda is very extensive. Currently, it's 15 pages long. The agenda is divided up between priority items and support items. And the rule of thumb in there is a priority item is an item that the city and the IGR department is the lead on. We take responsibility for drafting the language, identifying authors, pulling together stakeholders, compiling the testimony, and really taking charge of that piece of legislation. If something's a support item, the city is on the team. We're part of a coalition advancing that item. That can take the form of council members coming to testify on behalf of an item, providing letters of support, providing city-specific information. So, for example, our friends at the League of Minnesota Cities often take charge of a lot of issues that affect all cities, and we'll provide them with information about how that policy might impact the city of Minneapolis in particular. So that support role can take many forms, and we're always looking for creative ideas about how we can support our partners. But as you see in front of you, our legislative agenda has these broad categories: public finance, capital investment, public safety, transportation, housing. Municipal governance tends to be a very broad category. A lot of our reg services items fall in there. City livability, environment and sustainability, and jobs and economic development. Under that, you see just some highlights of some of the really large items that we focused on over the last few years within those larger categories. So before I move on to the capital investment, are there any questions now around the legislative agenda process?
Yes.
Councilmember Andrew Johnson.
Thank you. So I realize that this is the 30,000-foot view, and we have an extensive agenda here. I guess I was wondering around a couple of things. First off, do we get reports back on the success of the agenda, how many things get passed and how many things don't? And another piece is really on the specificity of some of these items. Some are very, very specific in terms of what we're trying to accomplish, and others are just very broad generalizations of things that I think all of us would tend to agree with. And so I just wanted thoughts on that, on the reporting back, the specificity, and also, if this is typical of what other cities provide in terms of the length, because it is extensive, does that serve in any way as a hindrance to us?
All very good questions. I think I've got them all. If I miss any, please let me know. So, Councilmember Johnson, first of all, in terms of reporting back, that happens in many different ways throughout the course of the year. Every year, every department provides the Results Minneapolis report back. So usually midsummer to the end of the summer is when IGR does our results report, where we take down the entire long legislative agenda and break down every single item and tell you what happened, what was achieved, what action might have occurred on every single item in that 15-page agenda. Whether it was no action or a total home run, we tell you everything. In addition to that, at this council meeting, each cycle, we'll be coming and updating you about what's happened over the last couple of weeks. What do we see happening over the next few weeks? So we'll be providing you that constant update in this format as well. In addition to that, we have historically done a newsletter that comes out every Friday during the legislative session that the IGR intern has been responsible for compiling, just giving you the highlights of what happened that week at the Capitol for items that are of specific interest to the city of Minneapolis. We're working with the communications department right now to find out if that's the right way to be doing that. Is that old-fashioned? Should we be doing a Twitter feed? Should we be having a blog that's updated more often? And we're exploring those kinds of items. So if any of you have ideas for kind of the media part of how the best way to keep you updated would be in that regard, we're working on that right now. Your question about the specificity of the items, it is something that we go back and forth on, and it really depends on what the issue might be. We do try to stay a little broad because as the session progresses, these legislative items ebb and flow and change almost every week, sometimes every hour. And if we are too specific in our agenda, then we have to come back to you to amend that item. So even, for example, today, putting the $950 amount in with the minimum wage piece, that's more specific than we have been in the past, just because now we're to the point in that item's process where being that specific is okay. But traditionally, we do like to be a little broader. If we do have a question about where would the city be on this particular item because a statement is broad, what do we really think about this bill, then we bring that back to you guys for more specific guidance. But we really do try to remain nimble just because the legislative session, those items change so frequently. In terms of the length of the agenda, it really is in line with a lot of, the county's agenda, other cities, the league, they have a much longer one than we do. But we feel like it is an appropriate length. We revisit it every year to see are there items that can be combined or reworded or shortened or things that we don't work on anymore. So if you see things of that nature, please let us know. But I would say that IGR is comfortable with the length and structure and format of the agenda right now. We feel like we have enough guidance from you with the language, but without too much specificity that we can't be nimble when we need to be.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Very good.
Do you have a question?
I have a general comment, but perhaps you'd like to wait for any other questions.
It looks like you're the only one in the queue. Councilmember Fry.
Thank you, Chair Cano. I just had a couple of things to point out. First, as many of you may know, Commissioner Gail Dorfman has resigned. I wanted to thank the Commissioner for her 14 or 15 years or so of extraordinary service. Secondly, as you know, there will be a series of elections that are coming up, and just yesterday, Hennepin County very graciously offered to handle the cost. And in fact, they instructed the county auditor to perform all necessary responsibilities for the election to be held on that date, including payment of all the election costs. I think this is an extraordinary gesture, and I also just wanted to call to the council's attention a state statute, which is Minnesota Statute 383B, .031, which provides that any vacancy in the county board, which is more than 6 months, must be filled by a special election. This is a statute that only pertains to Hennepin County. All other counties have much more broad discretion and authority to handle their elections as they see fit. And the scenario that we have right now is that we're going to have a primary followed by a general, followed by an individual taking office for about 7 days, and then they're going to immediately file again for another primary and another general. And regardless of which municipality is covering the money, it is a substantial amount of money. We have figures, certainly from our clerk, of upwards of $155,000, perhaps $140,000 in overhead costs, not beyond that. So we are very pleased and thankful that the county will be covering those costs, and perhaps we all should work together to support the county in any efforts that they see to make sure that the statutes and their legislative agenda is as ideal as it could be. And so again, I wanted to thank Commissioner Gail Dorfman for her extraordinary service, as well as the county for their work on this upcoming election.
Thank you for your comments. will you be responding?
No, Madam Chair, just to appreciate the comments, then to continue with the piece on capital investment.
Please
That's
do so.
appropriate. Thank you. Okay, so if you continue on your presentation, I think it's, I have page 3 here, capital investment process. We revisit the legislative agenda every year. The capital investment process, however, has a much longer time frame, sometimes many, many years. But historically, it's really approached in kind of a 2-year cycle. We, as a city, adopt our bonding priorities in the end of an odd-numbered year. So I'm going to start this in the beginning here. So capital investment is funded through the state GO bonds. Those bonds have a maximum usage of 20 years, and they must be committed within 4 years. That commitment piece is not about necessarily spending it or finishing the project. They just must be obliged within those 4 years. If those funds are not obliged within those 4 years, then the state does have the right to bring that money back to the state. So it's very important that IGR always works with our city departments to make sure that we are paying attention to that clock and that everyone knows where they're at in that time process. The use of these bonds is limited. You can't bond for just anything. Bonds must be used for projects that are publicly owned and have a clear public purpose. State and local governments may request capital investment funds as well. So you'll see bonding requests come from state agencies. So, for example, the Department of Corrections will request bonds to rehabilitate a prison or something like that. Cities will request bonds for bridges and other public buildings and infrastructure and wastewater and sewer and things of that nature. So there are competing bonds coming from different units of government and different parts of the state, and crafting a well-balanced bonding bill is always an interesting process to watch, where you're really balancing the needs of the state versus the needs of the local units of government, and then having that geographic balance as well. The primary work of a capital investment cycle is done in odd-numbered years. So we have just finished the odd-numbered year of 2013, and we're now obviously in 2014 being an even-numbered year. This is the legislative session then that the legislature will be looking at bonding proposals. But the paperwork and the groundwork done to get ready for that 2014 legislative session where they actually vote on those projects and proposals is done in the year preceding. So we spent a lot of time doing a lot of tours in the summer and fall of 2013. This cycle really begins in April. Minnesota Management and Budget will notify state agencies that their application materials are available and that they will be due in the coming June. Local units of government have to do a couple of steps before we can submit our final projects for acceptance by MMB. The council passes a resolution. That resolution will say what our priorities are, what our projects are, and what priority order they are listed in. That then has to be submitted to Minnesota Management and Budget along with all of our documents supporting those projects. In addition to those documents, the city has to identify, and all bonding proposals have to identify where that 50% match is coming from. That is something that is expected, whether it is a state project or a local unit of government project. We really need to identify where those non-state resources are coming from. They can be a private sector match, they can be a local contribution, they can be from a foundation, but whatever form it takes, the state is looking for those projects to have a dollar-for-dollar match, state sources versus non-state sources. Then moving through the summer of the odd-numbered year, Minnesota Management and Budget posts a list of all of the projects usually at the end of the summer of the odd-numbered year. That's always a really fun list to look at. Who's thinking about what, where are cities and localities going to be 15 years from now. It's always really fun to think about what Minnesota is going to look like 15 years from now, 20 years from now, and you can really get a feel for that looking at that list. Then as we go through September and January, that's when the capital investment committees of the House and Senate take their tours around the state, and they really do incredible work. They travel the entire state and they look at almost every single project that's on those lists, and it's really an incredible task, and we thank them for their commitment to that and the diligence and the work that they put into that. They're out there in the freezing cold and the blistering sun to make sure that these funds are spent appropriately. They usually come to Minneapolis towards the beginning of the fall, maybe beginning of the winter, hopefully not the beginning of the winter. We don't like to be out there on a freezing cold bridge, but sometimes that happens. We like to help them with their scheduling. And then as we move into January of the even-numbered year, that's when the legislative piece, the legislative action for the bonding cycle really kicks off, and that's what you've been probably seeing over the last several weeks. The governor's proposals for what he or she would like to see in their bonding bill are due to be presented to the legislature no later than January 15th of that even-numbered year. Typically, that means they show up on January 15th, but they could show up sooner. This year, they did show up on January 15th. And it's always interesting to see because that's, kind of the first salvo in the bonding debates is what's in the governor's bill and what is not in the governor's bill. And then as we move through February and March, the beginning of the legislative session, projects will have hearings at the Capitol. Not all projects have hearings. If a committee feels they really got a good feel for a project when they were out touring, maybe they don't feel the need to have another hearing. So we sometimes have hearings on our bills, and sometimes it's not completely necessary if the committee feels they really understand it thoroughly. In about March, and again, this is really kind of a rule of thumb. The committees and the legislature can really do what they want. But as a rule of thumb, in March is when we'll see the committees come out with their individual bills, the House bill and the Senate bill. They will have a lot of projects similar to the governor, and they'll have a lot of projects that the governor did not have. So you end up in the end with those three different bills, and then the rest of the session is spent kind of, negotiating the resolution and the combination of those three different proposals. So March is when you'll see those committee bills come up and be marked up by the committees. And again, that can happen any time in session. And then once the bills leave the Capital Investment Committee, then they go to the floor vote. And the really important thing to remember is that you do need 60% to pass the bonding bill. It is not the traditional simple majority. I would say that most legislators and policymakers believe that that's a really good rule to have. When you're spending that kind of money and you're investing those kind of dollars in the bread and butter infrastructure of a state, that it's important that that bill be geographically balanced and bipartisan, that those decisions are supported by 60% of the members. And then once those bills pass their floors, then we move into the conference committee phase where the differences between the two bills are negotiated. And then final passage usually comes towards the end of session. It can come sooner. It really depends on what that session might be. If leadership in a particular session wants to get that item off the table, then maybe they'll vote on it sooner. Oftentimes it ends up being towards the end of session and part of the end of session negotiations to resolve a particular legislative session. And then just to give you a quick overview of the City of Minneapolis capital investment projects, how that process works, and then what our projects are for this current legislative session. Just like MMB requests, the City of Minneapolis projects must have a regional or statewide significance in order to be considered. That's a rule of thumb that MMB follows and that the legislature looks to, and it's something that we also, of course, carry forward then through our bonding process. There really has to be that regional or statewide significance. It might be significant to the City of Minneapolis, but it has to have that broader context as well. City departments typically suggest worthy projects to the City Council, and then it is ultimately, of course, the City Council's ultimate decision about what projects will be put forward in that resolution that goes to MMB and at what dollar amount and in what order those projects will be listed in terms of priority. And again, our projects, like everyone else's, must have that 50% non-state match to go along with them. And then finally, just so you know where we're at for 2014, this list was again passed by that resolution in 2013 and then also incorporated into the city's 2014 state legislative agenda. The city's top project is the revitalization and redevelopment of Nicollet Mall for a $25 million request, 35W North and South Storm Tunnel Preservation for $4.5 million, Pioneers and Soldiers Cemetery rehabilitation at $1.9 million, and then a new project this year, which is the Emergency Regional Drinking Water Backup Supply Wells. And that is in there for $1.5 million. That's a new project for us this year. And just to note that city projects are separate from some of our partner jurisdictions here in the cities, separate from Hennepin County, the Park Board, the public schools, and our partners of that nature. They are separate jurisdictions with their own elected bodies, and even while some of their projects might physically be located within the city of Minneapolis, they are under the jurisdiction of some of our partners. So those are their bonding requests that they put the time and the effort into, and we all typically support each other's requests, but those separate jurisdictional boundaries are important to understand. And then the final update for where we are right now for 2014, as I mentioned, the governor's bonding bill came out on January 15th. There were $2.9 billion of requests that went to Minnesota Management and Budget, and $986 million was recommended for GO bonding. Nicollet Mall in this process received a recommendation for $20 million of funding. That's below the $25 million that we requested. We are obviously continuing to push for that $25 million. That's an important number for us to have. And the House and Senate recommendations are, of course, to be determined. A session has not started yet, so we'll keep you updated as those bills roll out in the coming weeks. And Madam Chair, that is all I have for now, and I'll stand for questions.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the council members? Councilmember Frey?
Thank you, Chair Connor. Just one quick question. So I understand the governor's proposal is for the $20 million for Nicollet. The bill that's actually being submitted, though, that's just so I'm understanding correctly, that is 25, right?
Yes, Councilmember Frey, yes. Our bill was submitted last year,
Right.
so it's still alive, for this year, and our request is for $25 million in the legislation as well.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Seeing no other questions. Oh, thank you. Sorry, it's the monitor's a little slow to pull up the names.
worries,
So,
no worries.
Councilmember Johnson, Andrew
Yes,
Johnson.
just a quick question. Has there been any discussion on the Midtown Farmers Market? I know I talked with some legislators on that previously about potentially doing a bonding request for that. Just curious where that's at.
Councilmember, I'm going to ask Mr. Ranier to chime in too. I know a few years ago it was part of, I believe, the Park Board's bonding request package. We did tour the location a few years ago, and then it came off of their list and has not been put back on for the moment. So that's all the information I have. I know it's not a current request.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Johnson, it's my remembrance that Senator Torres Ray introduced some legislation, I think a couple of years ago, some dollars for a site in South Minneapolis. And also I'm aware that some of the legislators from the district were talking about possibility of this session introducing something, but I haven't seen it yet.
Thank you. That would be great. I know there's a lot of people in Ward 12 who use that site and would love to see something happen there. So,
And Madam Chair, Councilmember Johnson, the Farm Bill just passed, and we're going through that to see if there's any sort of possibility of applications for federal funds for urban farming farms, and we're not sure, but we will go through that and bring this to the committee when we are able to finish our analysis. Great. As you're aware, in the past, we could probably have gone to our congressman and asked for earmarks. However, an earmark being something where the congressman or the senator would put it right in the appropriation statute and say, the farmers market in Minneapolis will get X, or a bridge would get X. Congress dropped that process 5 years ago. So the appropriations process isn't as much fun as it used to be in the federal government.
all right. Thank you.
Sorry to hear about that. Okay. Are there any other questions? Are you finished with your presentation?
I am.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Wonderful. So I just wanted to add, as the council member who does represent the area of the Midtown Farmers Market, I'm actively working with the IGR staff to try to figure out how we can potentially apply for some funds through the state or federal government. So I appreciate you raising this question, Council Member Andrew Johnson. So if there are no other questions, I will move to receive and file the report. Those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. That motion carries. Our second item is a presentation by the League of Minnesota Cities, and Mr. Gene Ranieri will be introducing the presenters.
Madam Chair, members, we are members of the League of Minnesota Cities. It is a statewide organization of cities. It started about 101 years ago. It started as a part of the extension of the University of Minnesota. It is now an organization that does many services for cities. One of those services is working at the Capitol, helping us develop policies to work with at the state level and also at the federal level. We're really pleased today to have the IGR staff, our counterparts, here to make a presentation on a couple topics, state and local government relationships, also transportation funding, and then some discussions about the so-called unsession or mandates. To make the presentation to start off will be the director of IGR for the League of Minnesota Cities, Gary Carlson. We'll introduce the rest of his staff and go from there.
Wonderful.
Chair Cano and members, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Gary Carlson. I'm with the League of Minnesota City staff. And if I can reminisce for just one moment, I started my government relations career right here in Minneapolis in 1983 and testified before this IGR committee. I think at the time it was chaired by Kathleen O'Brien, if I'm not mistaken, way back in the day. And I was on the M floor for many years, well, actually for 2 years before I left and ultimately ended up at the League of Minnesota Cities. So it's wonderful to be back here today. The council chamber looks a lot better today than it used to. So for those of us who have been around a long time, we remember that this chamber was nowhere near as nice as it is today. A little bit about the League of Cities. Gene gave a good introduction, but let me just touch on a few other things. He did indicate that we are just over 100 years old, and we've been around a long time, and we were formed actually by the city officials themselves with the basic intent that working together, we can share knowledge, information, and be better at the jobs we are charged to do by the citizens. And we were with the University of Minnesota for many years. Broke off I think in the late 60s, before my day, and have since been an independent organization, and we're located right over adjacent to the state capitol, and if you ever need a place to park and want to come in and see us, I'd love to have you there. We do have 830 members of the state's 853 cities. I apologize. So the largest non-member city for the league is less than 200 population. Virtually every city in the metro area and most cities in the state are members of the organization. And let me just also say that we have an umbrella organization at the national level. Councilmember Quincy, you asked about the minimum wage issue, and the National League of Cities is very involved in living wages and the minimum wage issue at the federal level, and we are members of the National League of Cities as well. And they are pushing the issues of living wage, earned income tax credit, as well the minimum wage at the federal level for us. So we are working with the National League. There are 49 other state leagues, just to let you know that. The only state that does not have a League of Cities is the state of Hawaii, unfortunately, so we never get to go visit there. But the rest of the states do have sister organizations, and actually we work quite a bit together on issues that confront us at our respective legislatures. It's a very rich exchange of information among the state leagues. Briefly, the other things the league does, we do government relations work. We also do conferences and training. We have an annual conference, which is an opportunity to interact with city officials from across the state. We also do a newly elected and an experienced official orientation conference that's coming up this week. It's an opportunity to intermingle with other city officials from across the state. Council member, I believe you're going to perhaps one of the events, if I'm not mistaken.
This weekend?
Yes.
Yes, Friday and Saturday on my
Good.
calendar.
Thank you for attending, and I think you'll find it to be a useful exercise. And we have some good hands-on people with good advice about being a city council member. So
Great.
we also do research and inquiry. We have a staff of attorneys that answer questions from cities. So it's basically a consortium that allows you to ask questions and get good legal responses on how to draft an ordinance, best practices on how to hire and fire, how to handle issues that may arise. We've got several attorneys that work in that department. We also are, believe it or not, a large insurance company. Minneapolis does not insure directly through the league. I think most of your insurance is self-insured. But back in the late 70s, when the insurance industry was really unwilling to write affordable insurance for municipal governments because we were a very high risk, the cities got together under our umbrella, formed their own insurance company for property casualty insurance and for workers' compensation insurance, and that's been a very successful effort that has saved cities many, many dollars as a nonprofit insurance provider for cities across the state of Minnesota. Very briefly on our policy development process, we're going to talk to you in just a minute about what our legislative agenda is, similar to what Melissa just did. And I should say, by the way, that we work extremely closely with your staff. And when you don't see them here at City Hall, I can guarantee that I can find them for you because they're usually around the Capitol with me and my staff. And if you ever need to find them, just feel free to give us a call. But we have a policy development process where our city officials actually gather for 3 months during the summer. We have meetings through July, August, and September to develop our policy positions. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. But the basic agreement among the city community on issues that will form our legislative agenda is how we work. A very democratic process, ultimately approved by our board of directors when they do meet. And I should say on the Board of Directors issue, we do have a slot for the City of Minneapolis on our Board of Directors. Currently, that is occupied by Mayor Betsy Hodges. She's our immediate past president. When she is out of office after this year as our past president, we will be seeking another Minneapolis city official to serve on our Board of Directors. So if you're interested, Jim Miller, our Executive Director, would love to talk with you. So let me just move in briefly to introductions. With me today is, and I guess I'll just make it easy, Ann Lindstrom, first of all, is, you want to raise your hand, Ann? Ann is one of our newer staff members, and she joins us, actually. She worked here in Minneapolis for a while, kind of the way I started my career, and she works on elections issues, also works on, I call them the vice issues, liquor and tobacco issues, and also we'll be talking a little bit today about some of the mandate relief initiatives that the League of Cities is undertaking in the upcoming legislative session, and you also work on HR issues, I should say, human resource issues. Next to her is Ann Finn. She's the Assistant Director of the department. Ann has been with me now for, 13 or 14 years. I think we probably see each other more than our spouses during the legislative session, just simply because we spend so much time at the Capitol. Ann works on transportation, public safety issues, and just generally fills in on pensions and all sorts of other issues that come up. She's really my right-hand person. Sorry to tell you all that, but Ann is very much the right-hand person to help me navigate the legislative waters. And then finally, Laura Ziegler is here with us today. She's one of our newest staff members, and she works in a capacity known as an Intergovernmental Relations Liaison, and she's working for us on broadband, telecommunications, public utility issues, and also you'll probably interact with her as a elected city official because she does a lot of member outreach on our legislative efforts. So we'll be talking more with them in just a minute. So briefly, Jean asked us to talk about some of the issues on our agenda, and we do have a very voluminous policy booklet, and I guess we have copies for you. We can either give them out now or later. It's rather voluminous book of policies, but we'd like to talk with you about 3 or 4 issues that we're going to be working closely with your IGR staff on in the upcoming legislative session. Jean asked me to first talk about the whole issue of the state-local partnership. And for those of you who are new council members, if you're not haven't been really attuned to this relationship in Minnesota, if you go back just a few years, back into the 60s, in Minnesota, cities really went it on their own. We had to raise our own money. We didn't have a lot of a partnership with the state of Minnesota. But in the late 60s, the state of Minnesota decided that the property tax system was way too burdensome. Our property taxes were extremely high in Minnesota. In fact, I think if you go back in time, the total take through the property tax for the state and for all local governments was about 60 to 65% of all of the tax dollars generated in the state of Minnesota. And at that time, many legislators felt that that was really not a very sound balanced system of taxation. And they decided in late 1960s, in 1967 to be exact, to enact a sales tax. And that sales tax was a very important part of this overall process. It became the funding source for local governments. And when it was first enacted, the state undertook a process whereby they dramatically increased the support for the state school systems. They dramatically increased the support for counties and also for cities. And in 1971, they actually created the program now known as local government aid, which distributes about $500 million, $507 million in 2014 to cities across the state. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But this system in Minnesota is relatively unique. Our sister state of Wisconsin has some similarities to Minnesota in that it generates a lot of money at the state level. And it also uses local governments as the service provider. If you think about it on a day-to-day basis, most of the services that you receive are likely going to come from your local units of government. If you have kids in schools, if you drive on a road, if you drink the water, much of what you experience on a daily basis is really a part of that Minnesota miracle. The expectation that cities, counties, and schools are going to deliver many of the services, and that the state is going to partner with us to raise the monies necessary to make sure that the property tax system doesn't overburden our taxpayers. Over the years, that system has gone through vacillations. When I was here in Minneapolis in the early 80s, we had just come out of a very severe state budget crisis, several special sessions and several major cuts in that program. In the 80s, we slowly recovered. Through the 90s, we were recovering. We had a little hiccup in the early 90s with a recession. But the real challenges really evolved in post 9/11 when we had a major economic recession. And I think Gene likes to say that when the state's budget catches cold or when the state sneezes, we catch their cold, because when the state balances its budget, typically they've gone after cities and counties, to a lesser degree school districts, as a way to reduce their spending and therefore balance their budget. So we end up having to play a little bit of a counterbalancing game to help the state balance its budget, and that's been an ongoing challenge for us as we argue for that solid state-local partnership. The recession of the late 2000s was extremely difficult on that balance. Minnesota cities used to receive in excess of $586 million in local government aid. In the depths of this last recession, that was reduced down to $426 million. So while our budgets were being stressed by the recession, the state partnership with us was going south, and we saw over $160 million of overall cuts in that revenue sharing program. Good news is, and let me just finish up on a note of good news, this last session, and Gene can attest that we spent many, many hours together in Representative Dabney's office, also with Representatives Mahoney and from Duluth, Representative Simonson, working on local government aid updates and reform. We reached a very good agreement, I think, that we believe will bring some balance to that system. And in exchange for sitting down, coming up with a system that we think will not only reflect the needs of cities into the future, but that will just be a more understandable system, the legislature dedicated an additional $80 million into that program. So that was the biggest increase in the LG appropriation, honestly, since probably, I don't know, the early 2000s maybe, or late 1990s. So the legislature really did, as a result of our working together, the cities of Minneapolis, St. Paul, the outstate cities, the League of Cities, they did basically invest in our cities as a way to make sure that we can continue to provide the services that our citizens need. One other thing I would like to discuss before we go into some of the transportation issues. This last session, too, we actually were finally successful in reversing a 20-year trend in Minnesota public finance policy, and that is that we re-exempted cities from the sales tax on the purchases they make to run their operations. Believe it or not, Minnesota in 1992, in a way to balance their budget, decided that necessarily, rather than cutting aids or doing other things, they decided to extend the sales tax to the purchases that cities make. So when you buy a computer, you buy a pencil, you buy a pad of paper, we have heretofore had to pay 6.875% tax on that purchase, which directly comes out of your local property taxes. This last session, and there's a lot of people that can be credited, but Senator Rest from just west of here was really instrumental in making this a very major issue. She wanted to reform the system and get us out from underpaying the sales tax. And in the end, we were granted an exemption on many of our purchases. Now, we have some work to do to clarify that law. That's one of my efforts this next legislative session, to fix and make sure that it applies to the majority of our purchases. But it was another way that the legislature wanted to help cities provide services more efficiently and effectively. And actually, if you look at the booked savings of that, the estimate was that cities would save about $75 million as a result of that sales tax exemption. So all told, this last session, working with your staff, working with other cities, I think we had some very sound successes in reinvigorating the state-local partnership in Minnesota. Before I turn it over to Ann Finn to talk about transportation issues, do we want to take questions right now? Are there any questions at all about local aid, sales tax issues, or the state-local partnership?
Councilmember Johnson, not on the queue yet, but I see
All
you.
right, all right, thank you, Madam Chair. My only question was, you mentioned earlier broadband and internet service. I'm a huge fan of fiber optic internet. The potential of bringing gigabit internet service to our city, it's a huge economic driver. I'm curious where you're at with that, and if you're actively working on any initiatives around that.
Council member, I'm going to leave that for when Laura Ziegler gets up here, because she's been extremely involved in recent meetings and discussions, and we are working aggressively. It is an economic development issue for our cities, and one that I think we have some good support for right now with the current legislature. So I will leave that to Laura to discuss, if you don't mind, when she does get up here in just a few minutes.
Not at all. Thank you.
Well, with that, if I could turn it over then to Ann Finn, and she will discuss some transportation-related funding issues.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much for having us today. As Gary mentioned, I've been with the League about 14 years, and I'm approaching now, I think, my 20th legislative session. So I've been through this stuff a few times, and I'd be happy to talk with you either here or as you navigate the future legislative processes and what kinds of things that you have curiosity about. I'd like to spend my time today talking with you about transportation, and I'll start by just giving you a little briefing on recent history with the transportation funding issue. We have seen no significant change in funding since 2008. And for those of you who were around at that time, you'll recall that to get that funding package passed, it required an override of then Governor Tim Pawlenty by the legislature under the leadership then of House Speaker Margaret Anderson Kelleher. This was also at the time in the wake of a tragedy, and that happened in your city, when the I-35W bridge collapsed. Now, since then, we've had no real infusion or comprehensive funding package as it pertains to transportation. We've had various efforts. Most recently, Governor Dayton created what he called the Transportation Finance Advisory Committee, and that was made up of a broad group of stakeholders from all over the state, from all walks of life. We had folks who were business-oriented, folks who were very concerned about city issues, economic development issues. In fact, our current Transportation Commissioner, Charlie Zelli, before he was the Commissioner of Transportation, was appointed to that committee as well. And they released some pretty startling facts about the needs statewide for transportation investments. Unfortunately, it seemed to a lot of the folks that would have had to vote on some of the initiatives that report recommended were kind of skittish at the time about what kinds of recommendations were made. The first and foremost being a 40-cent per gallon gas tax increase. So when that rolled out last session, it was well received, of course, by transportation advocates, but maybe not so much by the folks who had to make sure that it could be implemented in a way that balanced the state budget and other priorities. So that left a lot of folks disappointed last session, and I would say it was one of these sort of unresolved issues. There were other finance packages put together last session because it was the odd year of the budget biennium, but the transportation bill was pretty thin. Going into 2014, it seems that there is some momentum for perhaps a comprehensive multimodal transportation bill. There is a new group that's formed called Move Minnesota, and the League and a number of other entities. I think now they're up to close to 150 entities that have joined that coalition, and they're working to advance a transportation package. We also have some very strong transportation committee chairs in both bodies. They both come from your city. Representative Hornstein chairs the House Transportation Finance Committee, and then Senator Scott Dibble chairs the Senate Transportation Committee. And in my conversations with both of them, they seem very optimistic that we'll get something done this year. And I think they're just the right leaders to do it. So we'll be in close communication with them, as I'm sure your staff will be. I guess I would stop there and just say that, the League is going to be supporting any efforts both in the bonding bill that Ms. Lesh talked about earlier, and then also any efforts that we can make through the transportation finance process to implement a package that is beneficial statewide and is multimodal. We would sure appreciate any help that you can provide, and I would leave you with the message that it seems that the message that's resonating the best at the Capitol right now is one that ties our economic health in the state of Minnesota and in our local communities to a very strong transportation infrastructure. With that, I would take any questions. Do we have any? Anyone have any questions? No? Okay, sounds great. Thank you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Ann Lindstrom, and I'm one of the lobbyists with League of Minnesota Cities. Jean asked that I talk a little bit about a specific bill that we've been working with your IGR staff quite closely, but I also just want to step back and talk a little bit about the unsession, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about, and what that means, and probably more importantly, how we're going to try and use that to our advantage. So the governor has talked about this being a year that instead of adding on to statute books, really trying to streamline things and make government more efficient and user-friendly for people. So the League of Minnesota Cities is often looking at mandates required by the state on our cities and local units of government. And a lot of times that comes down to different reporting requirements and oftentimes means us playing defense on behalf of our cities. But one of them, and the one that I specifically want to talk about today, has been around for a very long time, and we've worked on it for a very long time, and it brings up a lot of different interesting issues around public policy. And so the bill that we have looks at easing the publication requirements for cities and local units of government. So as you may be familiar, cities are statutorily required to publish different types of public notices in newspapers. And this can become quite costly. For your city alone, I believe the number is $150,000 a year to publish things, to get information out to cities or out to your citizens about what's happening at the city. So as we look at this, one of the things that, why we've been working on this so hard and why this fits into our mandate relief and then hopefully unsession is looking at how we can get information out to citizens in a way that makes the most sense to them. So right now, the statutory requirement is that a city chooses one designated an official newspaper, and it has to be in English to get the information out. So what our bill would do is it would allow cities the option. So it would be up to them to decide if they want to continue publishing this information in newspapers or in a website or both. So it would allow cities to be able to use their website to get the information out to people. So we're really hoping that we can utilize the unsession theme to really move this through. While the cost factor I think is important, it does vary a lot. And remember that we represent 834 cities, and so the cost can vary. I think what's more important is looking at the true intent of the statute, which is creating access for citizens to what's happening at their government level, and then where citizens go to get that information. And if cities have the resources freed up so that they can maybe more develop robustly their online presence, or they look at different community newspapers, spend money, look at translating, that allows them more opportunity to do that. So we're going to keep charging ahead on this. As Ann said, with looking at your support on things like transportation, we really can't emphasize enough how important it is that our city officials across the state get on board and work with our legislators about the different priorities that we have. We also have city resolutions, things like that. And we've already been meeting with legislators with your staff as well. So I can take any questions about that if you have them. Okay, then I'll turn it over to Laura Ziegler.
Good afternoon, council members. as Gary and Ann mentioned, my name is Laura Ziegler. I am the IGR liaison. So that means I advocate on issues, but then I also have a grassroots advocacy / member outreach component to my position. So I'm just going to briefly wrap up our time with you here today to discuss our sort of grassroots level. And Gary mentioned earlier, throughout our policy development process, we have 4 policy committees, each with different issue areas that they address. And so we just like to thank Jean and Melissa in particular, past Minneapolis staff and city officials that have participated on those policy committees. So you can be assured that your positions are represented on those committees. And we appreciate, their commitment to that process. And this past year alone, we had over 150 city officials participate in those policy committees from across the state, and those are both elected and appointed. And so, as I said earlier, this is really a grassroots process, and so we'd like to personally invite you to join any of those committees. We know you have packed schedules, so we do offer a remote online option, or you could at a minimum receive the meeting packets if you're interested in what sort of positions are coming forward and items for discussion. So you also heard my colleagues talk about our policy priorities this year, and so I'd just like to highlight some of the ways that you can stay informed. And we have several resources at the League to help you stay involved throughout the legislative session. Like most organizations in 2014, we have a website. We like to utilize it a lot. And so we have a number of resources on our legislative action page. You can receive weekly updates, daily updates. It's sort of up to you on what kind of information you'd like and how you'd like to receive it. We also have a number of member forums and listservs on different topic areas, as well as a legislative listserv that we send out action items on for things that we need on city officials to take action with their legislators. And additionally, I know most of you, if not all, have a Twitter account and maybe are active on Twitter. And so the League and the League's IGR staff is also participates in that forum. And so we each have accounts that will frequently tweet, sometimes even play-by-play of the legislative hearings and the statuses of bills, or maybe an article that we posted on our website. So that's another way. Feel free to follow us. We also have a hashtag, LMCLeg, that you can track us on as well. And that information is also in our policy book that we'll provide to you, and I flagged it for you so you can look at all of our contact information, including our Twitter information. And I think Gary mentioned this earlier, we are located right by the Capitol at the corner of Rice and University. Please feel free to use our parking lot if you are going over to a legislative hearing or meeting with your legislators. Check in at the front desk. With your vehicle information, you're good to go. So with that, again, I just want to thank you for your time, for allowing us to be here today, and we look forward to continuing the strong partnership with the City of Minneapolis staff, and we look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you. Any questions? Oh, okay, thank you. Councilmember John Quincy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Not a question for you, but is that to conclude that LMC kind of presentation? Because I have a question for Mr. Carlson, if I didn't want to interrupt, though.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Madam Chair, would you like me to address that at this time?
Yeah, it'd be great to have the questions. Mm-hmm.
Councilmember Johnson, you inquired about broadband earlier, and our board has adopted our state broadband policy as one of our priorities this year. And so just to kind of inform our discussion a little bit, back in 2009, there was an ultra high-speed task force at the state level that offered some recommendations, and in 2010, the state actually voted and put into statute some state broadband goals. And so there has been a state broadband task force ever since then, and they just released last week a report that they submit annually to the governor with recommendations specific to the legislative arena. And so I'm actually in the process of sifting through that report, but it does go back to money. And so I think it's important they're looking for possibly some bonding money this year to infiltrate some broadband grants, potentially for folks to gain better access to broadband.
And Do you happen to know if there's a fiber optic internet component to any of this?
The task force helps inform some legislation. It's chaired by Chair Margaret Anderson Kelleher, and they are technology neutral with regard to that specific report, and that tends to be the case, even though many folks will say fiber optic is sort of the gold standard. They are most often technology neutral in that regard. But I'd love to talk with you further on that. There is a legislator from Red Wing, Senator Matt Schmidt, that has been a strong advocate for statewide increased usage of high-speed internet, and actually went around the state and had a couple of sort of town hall forums to talk with city officials. And so the mere fact that there's a proponent in the legislature that wants to talk about it, I think, is a move in the right direction.
Thank you.
Back to me.
Yes, Councilmember Quincy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Carlson, I wondered if you could just kind of help frame up the LGA conversation a little bit more, as we're because obviously the impact that we received last year in the session from our delegation, leadership, and governor's office was dramatic on how it impacted our property tax levy within the city of Minneapolis. And so I wanted to highlight how important that was. But I guess I wanted to ask the question a little bit more. Is LGA, how volatile is that source of funding? Is it formula-based? And what kind of things can we use to predict the spikes and valleys of LGA?
And Madam Chair and Councilmember Quincy, that's a very good question. And one of the issues that we identified in our discussions last year with Representative Davney was that the previous LGA formula, and I don't want to get into the regression analysis that's used for it, it's a very complex statistical formula, but the former system, one of the deficiencies that we all noted was that it was very volatile. Not just volatility when the legislature reduced the appropriation. There was actually volatility in the annual distribution for each city. And it was not unusual to see some cities rising and falling quite a bit from year to year, creating a very difficult budgetary process for the individual cities. Can we rely on this money for next year? Will it be there next year? Do we have to raise property taxes when it declines? So one of the major efforts as we looked at the formula was to try to reduce or minimize the volatility while still having a robust formula that responds to changing city needs. And this new system, we believe, does accomplish that very goal, that it will be more stable and predictable into the future. Right now, if the legislature puts additional money into the system, we can actually eyeball from year to year how much additional money each city will receive. It won't be exact until we know all of the statistics on each city. But we couldn't do that prior to this new formula. And I won't get into the details of how that works, but it was actually the brainchild of a former Minneapolis city staff member who was working in the Capitol. He came up with this idea late one night, and it actually piqued the interest of many of the legislators. And lo and behold, it was added to the formula and signed into law by the governor. On the issue of the appropriation into LGA, that's a very good question. And as I indicated earlier, when the state budget catches a cold, it tends to trickle down to local governments. I will say this, that the legislature this last year and the legislators that Jean and Melissa and I talked to about LGA were extremely supportive of the importance of LGA and the state-local partnership. The current batch of legislators, I think, is committed to that partnership with our local governments. And I think a lot of our councils have done wonderful things with those resources. I know there was a little bit of politic about whether taxes went down enough. Truth be told, a lot of our cities around the state have suffered through 3 or 4 or 5 years of very, very difficult budgets where they've held the line or cut their budgets. And just like the state this last year, where they finally realized they had a little bit of room to look at funding some programs that had been cut, so did our cities. And we think that they all use that money very, very efficiently. So I'm very hopeful that we can continue that partnership and reliance on the state as our partner to make sure that our property taxes in cities across the state do not rise to excessive levels, and that it will be a predictable source of revenue into the future.
Thank you. Just a little bit more about LGA in terms of what municipalities are able to use LGA funding for. Are they restricted anyway, or can it just go back into the general fund and be part of our regular budget process, et cetera?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Quincy, that's a very good question. LGA has always been essentially a general revenue sharing program where you as city council members make the decision on how that money is actually used. There have been discussions over the years that LGA should be maybe dedicated to public safety or roads or certain priority expenditures. The legislature has usually fallen back, or always fallen back, on allowing the councils to appropriate those dollars as they see fit to fit their local needs and local priorities, and they have not tagged it with any specific mandates for certain uses. So we think that's the most efficient way. If you need it for roads this year, you need it for public safety next year, that really should be a local decision, and the legislature has stood by that commitment to the flexibility for the council.
Very good. And again, thank you for the League's work on that effort, as well as Mayor Ryback, Councilmember Glidden, Council President Johnson. It was terrific work, and it's held us in good stead. We're looking forward to crafting a great budget for next year.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you. Is that the end of the presentations from your end?
Unless there's any other questions, we thank you.
Looks good. All righty. Thank you so much. Looking forward to the continued partnership, and thank you for your staff's time to come and present and help us understand more about what this looks like for us. So if there are no other questions, I will move to receive and file the report. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
The motion carries. Our third item is to authorize the city to be a member of Move MN. And Mr. Ranieri, could you please let us know
Sure.
what this is about?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, Move MN, or Move Minnesota, is a coalition of about 150 organizations dedicated trying to get passed in this session, or hopefully this session, a transportation bill that's very comprehensive, that has been mentioned before, multimodal. There's no fee involved in joining this organization. We're seeing more and more of these types of coalitions forming over an issue. We've been members in the past. Last year we were sort of an honorary member of the Clean Energy Coalition. We've been asked to join this organization. The League is a member, Metro Cities is a member, and I think there'll be some other cities joining, if not already. It's my understanding St. Paul will become a member too. And what it does means we'll be all working together, trying to get this legislation passed and working on a common goal.
Wonderful. Are there any questions? Seeing no questions, I move to authorize the recommendation from the staff to become a member of Move MN. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. The motion carries. Item number 4. Our next item is to authorize the city to become a member of the Clean Energy and Jobs Campaign. Mr. Ranieri.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. We were sort of like honorary members last year. The city was involved in energy legislation, particularly the whole solar energy omnibus bill. As part of that, we worked very closely with a lot of energy, environmental groups, labor groups, solar manufacturers, and they had formed a coalition or a campaign to work on energy legislation. And they will be continuing this session, but probably more in the future in 2015. A lot of things were groundwork for 2015. So we would be, again, this is a no-fee organization. We would be at the table working on policies, and we would recommend membership.
Sure. Any questions? Seeing no questions, I move to authorize the city to become a member of the Clean Energy and Jobs Campaign. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. That motion carries. Our fifth item is to authorize the city to submit comments and reply to comments regarding the proposed Federal Communication Commission rules regarding the broadband deployment. Mr. Ranieri, could you please brief us on this?
Madam Chair, this is the item a little different than the ones before us today. This deals with the federal government. It deals with the Federal Communications Commission. What it is proposed, the FCC has several rules they propose. One of the rules they're proposing today, or they want comments on by the 3rd of February, and then comments to the comments in March, is related to the deployment of broadband, particularly a couple issues dealing with local governments. There may be some sections of this rule dealing with the public right-of-way. and the zoning and regulations. And I will not go into detail, but Mr. Conover is here from the city attorney's office. We did submit comments back in 2011. I know this is a national issue. There are national associations involved in this, including the National League of Cities, all concerned about where the FCC is going in this issue, and the concern about we losing control of zoning, regulatory issues, as well as the right-of-way. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Conover for a more detailed but yet brief explanation.
Great.
Thank you. Corey Conover, Assistant City Attorney, to talk, as Gene said, briefly about this. The FCC issued a notice of proposed rulemaking, 170 wonderful paragraphs, about 100 pages of text, and in it they outlined some of the things they want to discuss as a part of this procedure, and then they also outlined some of the proposed rules. The FCC believes that local governments are obstacles to deployment of broadband and are concerned about local government actions regarding heritage preservation, environmental review, co-location of broadband on some existing structures in a bunch of other areas. And so what they propose to do is basically tell us what we will be doing when it comes to some of these devices. And some of it interferes with areas that traditionally local governments have made decisions on, and they've made those decisions by balancing all kinds of considerations about transportation, preservation, and communication. The city of Minneapolis isn't opposed to broadband, quite the reverse. We're trying to be a leader, but we need to do it in a way that doesn't harm those other values, and that is the national consensus of all the various national municipal groups. And so a bunch of them will be filing comments. At the center of it is federal legislation that states a state or local government may not deny and shall approve any eligible facilities request for a modification of an existing wireless tower or base station that does not substantially change the physical dimensions of such tower or base station. Well, as you might notice, there are a bunch of words in there that need to be defined, and the FCC has decided they will define them. And they're going to define substantially change in a way that potentially, in their proposed rule, that way a lot of cities object to. For example, it could mean a 10% increase, or sticking out 20 feet, or 4 pieces of ground equipment, or a number of things would all be not a substantial change. And so cities and municipal organizations want to comment, and that's what we're proposing to do, to comment. So we've made some comments based on our 2011 document, and then based upon a lot of feedback from staff. So we've just recently completed a draft. These are due February 3rd. And so we won't get through full council, but if people have objections to the comments, let me know. And we can hold comments till the reply period by styling our comments as a reply to one of the national organizations or to the industry comments, but that's where we are. Are there
any other questions from our end? Councilmember Quincy?
Thank you, Mr. Conover. And thank you for reading all those pages and paragraphs, and then creating your own version of things to read through. Obviously, this is always an issue, especially when you're talking about local municipality and control over our land use. Part of this analysis, if this were to come to be through the FCC direction, has there been analysis on how many ordinances and other especially around zoning, that we would have to be forced to make to be in compliance with that, or is that just on the back end analysis?
We don't have an analysis of our code of ordinances of how many revisions we would have to make and so forth, but depending upon what these rules say, it could be quite a bit. And we get to the fundamental issue of, well, two fundamental issues. There's actually two main, I won't go on too long, but there's two main stripes to this. One is telling us what we can and can't regulate as to third persons, and two is telling us what to do with our own property, which is quite extraordinary, because there's a separate federal government and then a state and local government, and typically those are different, and the federal government doesn't get to use state property. And we're a subdivision of the state, so we are commenting on that issue, and we're telling them they can't do it, but the FCC has plowed ahead despite our earlier comments and the comments of other municipal organizations in 2011.
Okay, thank you. And just as a procedural question, Madam Chair, I'm assuming that the action that you're able to make today is to authorize you to make these comments in the timely manner by the February 3rd deadline without requiring full city council approval. Is that
right? We would take it as an indication that the comments that we're preparing, which will say nothing about council authorization, but that they're consistent, and if people have a problem with them, we can revise them through the reply, or we can take them back.
okay? Thank you.
And this unfortunately often happens in the administrative law context, where we're asked to comment on things, and then we somehow have to get it through the council cycle and get it through everybody. And so we have at the FERC and at the PUC and at various places commented first and then done receiving files, always with the understanding that we can change our mind and retract our comments.
Right. I'm pleased to hear that. Obviously, we don't want to slow this process down, but we don't want to expedite it beyond our control. So thank you for that, as always, Mr. Conover. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Seeing no further questions, I move to authorize the staff recommendation. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. The motion carries. And now I would like to open it up for announcements. If there's any announcements from council members and staff. Councilmember Andrew Johnson.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. One issue that's very important to the people of Ward 12 and to people across the city is pollinators. It's a topic that's important to our local food supply and local food economy, to agriculture across our state. I know fellow council members also have an interest in this, and I was wondering if Mr. Ranieri would be able to comment on any activities at the legislature to help protect our pollinators.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Johnson. Last year, the legislature had about 3 or 4 different sections of the agricultural, environment, and energy omnibus bill dealing with pollinators. One was to be a study by the Department of Agriculture to come back with some recommendations and just some data about the whole issue of pollinators. There's also some funding in the heritage bill, legacy bill, to do for the University of Minnesota to do some research. Since then, there has been a bee kill here in our city. There have been a group formed being concerned about the pollinator issue. Representative Wagenius is drafting language, is aware is meeting with the group. We met with Representative Wagenius this week. It's our intention to bring to the committee, and working with you, Councilmember Johnson, a policy statement dealing with this whole issue.
Great. Thank you very much, and I look forward to working with you on that.
Any other announcements? Seeing no further business before this committee, we are adjourned.